why do you think I had to recognize that God existed? If a public official is given tremendous amount of power, the privilege of exercising that power, that public official better understand where their ethics come from. The ethics that inform that decision making in the exercise of that power. They better have a pretty good understanding where that comes from. And if they're not willing to recognize that no one, not even the king, is above the law, and that God has a higher law, then this nation is in much bigger trouble than we even can begin thinking it is. If you asked all your government officials, call them up sometime, even the ones that we agree with, and ask them, well, what oath did you take? Why do you think you take that oath? Very few of them tell you that, well, before I'm given the privilege of exercising the power of the sword, you know, I have to affirm that I'll uphold the Constitution. I have to affirm to God that I'm going to uphold this rule of law called the Constitution. Most of them will probably tell you, well, it's a tradition that we've always done. We need to remember why we take that oath. We are taking an oath to uphold a rule of law. The 5 lawyers I told you about on the Supreme Court that rewrote the Constitution and amended the Constitution to add a liberty, knowing full well that they would never have to stand before any electorate and be responsible for the immense policy change that they made on millions of them, hundreds of millions of Americans. They took that oath to uphold this Constitution. Because the Constitution is their rule of law as well. When we run for office, or when we're appointed to the bench, you know, the temptation's there. I mean, I would have people come into my courtroom and say, there was a wrong that was there, but maybe the statute didn't fix the wrong. Who's the statute written by? Congress or the state legislature, right? Those folks are politically accountable to the electorate. If you don't like the statute, or if there's a problem with the statute and the law, the next election, you throw somebody out if they don't fix it. But I, as a judge, or a federal judge, they're appointed for life. You have the temptation right in front of you to fix a personal problem of somebody. But if the law doesn't allow you to do so, how ethical are you by fixing their problem? You may feel good that night about that person, but you haven't fixed the problem for thousands of millions of other people. Get to the elected branch and get them to correct it. We have to look to what our founders understood was this self-evident truth. We have to understand that every law is based in an ethical notion. Every piece of policy, every law that we enact asks a question. What is right and what is wrong? And so the question then is, how do we measure right and wrong? Do we measure it the way our founders suggested? Against self-evident truth? That there is a right and wrong, a good and bad? That all life has inherent value? No matter what the stage of life? Or do we say that is an old way of thinking, and let's think more like Darwin, where the law can evolve and public policy can evolve along the way. Instead of having a straight line on our heart to know the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, right and wrong depends on who's in power and how they're feeling on a given day. So what's right for you doesn't have to be right for me. What's wrong for you, it can be right for me. If you take that way of thinking, you have, in a sense, extinguished truth. Because what you've just said, that truth can be made up by whoever is deciding whether something should be truthful or not. Now, What color is the screen here?
White.
No. It's blue. It's okay for you to think that. We both can be right. Kind of funny when we're talking about the screen. Not so funny when we're talking about life. And when government decides which life is worthy of government protection and which life is not. Or worse, when government decides who gets to decide that question. They have done a lot of things to try and evict you from that process, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But in the meantime, there has to be a standard, and that standard has to reflect reality. Now, a few days ago, I flew to New Orleans to speak at the National Christian Legal Society conference, where all the Christians from all the Christian lawyers from all over the country came once a year. And I flew out of Detroit Metro and flew into New Orleans. Now, on that day that I got on there, you know, I'm trusting that the pilot is going to believe in the founder's view of truth. North is north and south is south. We got a plane and we flew from north to south and I got there. Now, if say the founder decided to join, you know, the Michigan Liberal Union's idea of what truth is, that pilot on any given day would say, well, you know, today I think west is going to be south for me. And I would have been speaking in California to a group of people that I was not designated to speak for. Does this matter? I think it does. Oh, I love telling professor stories since I used to be one. A professor is driving along a road late at night and he comes up to a stop sign and slows down, looks both ways, and continues on through. Police officer sitting on the other side turns on his siren and pulls him over and says, "You ran a stop sign, sir. Please stop. Please show me your license." And the professor says, "Officer, wait a minute. I didn't do anything wrong. You know, I slowed down. It's the middle of the night. There's no cars out here. I slowed down and made sure there's no cars coming, and I didn't do anything wrong, officer." License and registration, please. "Officer, understand. Look, there was no cars out here. I slowed down. I didn't do anything wrong." "Step out of the car, sir." Guy steps out of the car. Police officer then begins to take his nightstick out and beat the professor over and over and over. And the professor says, "Stop, stop, stop." And the officer says, "Would you like me to stop, or would you rather me just slow down?" Truth matters. Truth matters. Truth has to correspond to reality as perceived by God. We need something to measure. We want something to measure our government actions by. We certainly measure our own personal actions by them every day. And you know you do that when you judge somebody else. I mean, we're not supposed to judge, but when we see somebody else that's acting outside these self-evident truths, we know it. Everybody in the room knows it. When we see government doing, we know that. We measure against the standard because we want to be right. If rules don't mean anything, if this rule of law means nothing, then who's ever in power gets to completely redefine ethics to mean whatever I want because I hold the power. Why are things intrinsically sacred and self-evident? Just take the Big Ten. We know this on our heart. We've always known it, but we tend to whisper. There was a great book, I haven't read the book, but I love the title. It's Why Do We Whisper? And it's basically about us conservatives. We're afraid to speak up. Why do we whisper about the Big Ten? Why do we whisper about these self-evident truths? The sacredness of life, the sacredness of religious conscience and worship, the sacredness of family and marriage, the sacredness of property, the sacredness of keeping your word. Our founders looked to those same standards when they founded this nation, put it in a rule of law, and said, these are the big limitations against government action. Government, you don't get to infringe on life. You don't, because it's sacred. You don't get to infringe on religious conscience. You don't get to infringe on religious speech. You don't get to infringe on property. Founders looked to those same standards when they formed this nation. And in their Constitution, and in our laws, we attempt to reflect these standards. Again, we're not asking for a theocracy here. We're just asking for truth to inform our governance. We're just asking for ethics in the real sense to inform our governance. Will we have the courage to do so? Our Canadian friends up north just held a major election. They just elected a prime minister who is a strong advocate of partial birth abortion as a human right, and has held that nobody in his political party shall be allowed to be in his political party if they hold a different view. Does truth matter in our governance? If we don't have the courage to stop whispering, this is where we're going. And if somebody, because they are holding government power, says that they can decide what life has value and what life doesn't, I challenge you to do just a little bit of recent history and study other governments that have taken that same position. It gets ugly and very, very dark very, very quickly. So, why do you think, if this is government, that our founders said, in the rule of law establishing our government, that this is not what it's going to look like. It's going to look like this. We're going to give some of the power over here, and we're going to give some of the power. Can I get an assistant up here? This one. Over here. And we're going to give some of the power over here. It goes back to this. Because if we're all born good, we wouldn't need to separate power and put some power over here and some power over here, would we? The Federalist Papers recognized that if men were angels, we wouldn't need a constitution. But yet the other side says we're all born good. We don't need self-evident truth. We don't need some outside source to look at. We can find it from within ourselves. We're all born good. And I'm telling you, when I used to teach constitutional law, for the longest time, about half the room would agree with that. For the last 10 years or so, 5 years or so especially, much less than half the room disagree with it. They all believe we're all born good, or at least with a clean slate. And then I would always find one person in there that was maybe a mother or a father who had children. We laugh because God's wrote that on our hearts. So we know this. You know, if you take a rattle and you give it to a baby, the baby loves the rattle and plays with the rattle. But if you add a second baby to the mix, and the second baby would like to partake in the rattle playing, they'll crawl over, and does the first baby say, "Oh, I'm born good. I want to just share this with you and give this to you"? No, the baby doesn't say, "I want to share my rattle." The baby says, "No, it's mine." these babies grow up. Some of them work in this building. Some of them work in this building. Some of them work in that other building. And that rattle represents power, doesn't it? No, it's